My name is Janine Sledham. I'm a graduate of United, class of 99, and I'm currently serving as professor in the practice of theology. One of my great loves is historical theology, and so it's a real pleasure for me today to introduce this session where we will explore some of United's founding history. During this session, we'll hear from Art Merrill, Emeritus Professor of the Old Testament, who taught here from 1958 to 1995, and you said also 4 years at... 4 of those years were at Mission House. Okay, thank you. And I never had the pleasure of having Art in the classroom, so maybe I could say that that's why I always think of him in such a jolly way. I never had to take a test or write a paper from him. But every time my husband took classes for him, John, and every time I see you, Art, or think of you, what I think of is that wonderful smile. It's a smile of grace and love. So what we're going to talk about is this history. Now, Art did not ask to write this history. It was Louis Gunneman, the founding dean, who on his deathbed gave Art the charge to finish the project that he had just barely started, writing a history of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. So, are you going to turn down Louis Gunneman on his deathbed? No, Art did write the book, United Theological Seminary, United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, an Ecumenical Venture. And we are very grateful that he did. He's here today to help us understand that founding history, and he is joined by 4 members of the class of 1965. Larry Bremer, Paul Kepke, Robert Tripp, and Carl Verkouteren. These men were part of the first graduating class at United, which meant that they were here as the physical foundations were being laid for many of the buildings on this campus. Many things then were unknown about how the future of this seminary would unfold. Paul Kepke made the effort to contact his classmates and urge them to share their stories. We're grateful to Paul for his work and for the presence of these 4 men here today. The hard part about this is that an hour is not going to really do justice to it, but an hour is what we have. So I'm going to do my best in the time that we have to keep things going. Art will present first, and then each member of the class of 65 will share some of their memories of their time at United. I'll do my best to moderate the session and keep us on time. And I'll say at the outset, we may or may not have time for questions at the end. I hope we do. But now it is my great pleasure to welcome Art Merrill.
It was literally on Lewis's deathbed, literally, that I was asked to write this history. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why you asked me to talk today, as well as the fact that I'm one of the few of the original faculty still left around. But you need to be very careful about what you hear and what you read. The very first sentence of this book is false. It says the seminary opened its doors in 1972. 5 people proofread that text. Reuben Hieneman, Clyde Steckel, Alice Strobel, I'm trying to think, Sue Ebers, and one other, I guess myself. And none of us caught that mistake. As Reinhold Niebuhr reminds us, to finitude and sin. And we do slant the data in the way that serves our own purposes. But the subject at hand is some of the early history and story of UTS. And I would like to start with the notion that this school is the interesting result of several factors. One was that neither of the 2 previous schools, Mission House Seminary and Yankton School of Theology, could be said to be flourishing. Mission House had about 40 students and 6 faculty. Yankton was even smaller. Both were being challenged by their respective bodies as to their viability. In fact, Mission House was subject to a motion on the floor of General Synod that it should either be closed or moved to another location. Many of the voices wanted Mission House to fold. Another factor was, of course, that the United Church of Christ was coming into existence with the formative synod in 1960, which cemented the merger of the Congregational Christian and the Evangelical and Reformed churches. Behind the scenes, there was a movement to get Mission House and Yankton to merge. Out of these factors, among others, was a statement we know as the basis of union, a document that was established 55 years ago, in May 4, 1960. The basis of union was drawn up in consultation of representatives from the Board of Home Missions, the General Council of the Evangelical and Reformed Church, the General Conference, that's the German Conference of the Congregational Churches, the Minnesota Congregational Christian Conference, and the Evangelical and Reformed Northern Synod. That statement was ultimately approved by the governing bodies just 1 month later, in June 1960, when the merger of the two denominations took place. It was that close and that tight. There are three affirmations in the basis of union that I would like to point to this afternoon. The first, of course, is the statement that this school shall be the uniting of two schools into an effective, ecumenical-oriented seminary. From the beginning, it was not to be a denominational seminary, but ecumenical. Secondly, the school shall affirm its responsibility to the United Church of Christ and shall be organically related to the United Church of Christ. Now that's a statement under the various views of the United Church of Christ, what it means to be organically related. And thirdly, it said this school shall prepare men and women for the whole ministry of the church. That was in 1960. It is these affirmations that I believe have shaped the development and story of UTS. As a seminary of the United Church of Christ, we are in many ways one of the first fruits of that union. And to many it seemed an obvious move that two so-called Germanic entities, Mission House Theological Seminary and Yankton School of Theology, could easily come together. But what constitutes an effective ecumenical seminary? For one, it took a location, a piece of land, a site where a school could be built. Many wanted it to be at the University of but because of the separation of church and state, it could not be that close. Others thought it should be located at one of the other seminaries of the denomination. But finally, the Board of Trustees chose 64 acres of land in New Brighton and had a vision of what might be. A model of that seminary that you can still see in the courtyard of the library is a vision of what might be, a tantalizing foretaste of a future. The architect of the school was Kenneth Whitehead, a UCC layperson who had just designed Lindbergh Terminal. And you can see certain parallels between the two buildings if you look at the railings, for example, in the library and the railings in the airport. But, of course, choosing 64 acres and buying it did not mean the end, for it created the Battle of Seminary Hill. For the fathers in those days of the town of New Brighton did not want to see this lovely parcel of land be dedicated to a tax-exempt institution. And so the battle raged, but finally the Constitution of the United States proved its worth, and the school was granted its permit to build. Construction was undertaken with funds from Lakeland College and Yankton College in recompense for the space they had formerly occupied. And the two former church bodies provided free tuition to their students, had provided free tuition to their students, but in the new denomination, this was no longer deemed possible. So monies were granted for only 10 years. After that, the new seminary, they said, would have to be self-sustaining. Part of that has led to the consequence that initially the top northern woods were sold off to a development to gain resources to continue its existence. And the second move was the selling off of where the faculty homes were. So we are now down no longer 64 acres, but I believe, 5, 6 acres maximum. The classroom building was the first one open and available. The library building did not become available until the spring of '63. And when it was available, it used to house, for those of you who weren't around in those days, the library, the staff, the faculty, and of course the basement with the bookstore and the refectory. Faculty homes were started at the same time as the school building and were slowly available. The Merrills and the Hilgemans were the first to take up residence in the midst of all the mud. Other faculty lived in the apartments in Columbia Heights, or their families did not come to campus until housing was complete. There was no student housing until 1965. The single students lived in an apartment building in Columbia Heights, and married students lived in various apartments in nearby communities, including my favorite location, the Pink Pony Motel. That was up on Highway 10. Out of these circumstances came values which informed the school in its early days. Community was forged in a difficult milieu. Cooperation and willingness to pitch in marked many situations. But the desire to forge a new school overrode the tendencies to look out for oneself or to complain. As a product of the United Church, United Seminary took the name of the denomination to be both united and uniting. It was to be an ecumenical school, bringing together not only various denominations, but also the two schools with two faculty and two student bodies. The merger of these two schools was not an easy accomplishment, but was facilitated by Dean Louis Gunneman. He was the calm in the midst of faculty discussions. He was the soothing oil when the gears began to creak and complain. There were 7 faculty from Mission House, 3 faculty from Yankton, but even of those 3, one went on to further study and never taught at United. The other finished up his doctorate at Union Seminary in New York. This imbalance between the two schools furthered some of the tensions of philosophies. The same imbalance was found in the student body. In the class of 65, there were, am I right, 15 graduates? 4 from Yankton, the rest from the ENR side. Some have said this was its own miniature ecumenical adventure, seeking to be united in uniting, and not without abrasions and growing pains. Slowly we became ecumenical in the larger sense. One of the early retreats was at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville. Based on the personal friendship of Louis Gunneman and the Dean of St. John's, Godfrey Diekman, who was also an expert in worship. The librarians of the seminaries early on joined together and brought Baptists, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, and United Church folks together. President Heinemann was himself an official observer to Vatican II. And even I was asked to teach at Northwestern Luther Seminary. And they were dubious about me, though I overheard one student said, "At least he believes in the text." And we know that we have been ecumenical in our choice of presidents. Reuben Heinemann, ENR, Dayton Hultgren, Presbyterian, Howie Mills, United Church of Canada, Ben Griffin, UCC, Wilson Yates, Methodist, Barbara Holmes, Disciples of Christ. We do have an ecumenical tradition. At the student level, the ecumenical character of the school was less obvious. There were, of course, the 2 schools with their distinct values and perspectives. But shortly thereafter, we had students from other denominations. The Methodists were initially reluctant to send their students, as they felt a Methodist ethos was not present. A similar situation was present with the Presbyterians, though the first non-UCC graduate was in 1967, Lloyd Rediger, a Presbyterian. It took quite a few years before the student was truly ecumenical, but the Board of Trustees was always ecumenical from the very beginning of its organization. And we wanted to be ecumenical in a larger sense, as open to a world with many possibilities. This was manifested in several ways. One was the use of Karl Barth's dictum that one should read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. The Bible is not only the book of the church and synagogue, but also a book of the world, and deals with real human issues in real human time. Another way the larger ecumenical perspective manifested itself in the curriculum was the introduction of courses that were grounded in human experience and then involved theological reflection. 3 new courses were organized: the Christian faith and the social order, the Christian faith and human personality, the Christian faith and economic and political life. Unfortunately, we never had a professor until very late in our history for the 3rd course of economic and political life. But we had Jim Nelson to teach the Christian faith and social order, and the first teacher, as I recall it, of the Christian faith and human personality was Clyde Steckel, who came before we could find a regular appointment. Not for him, but for somebody else. I had to get in my licks on him. It was also early in the life of the school that Jim Nelson and Charlie Leck went to Mississippi to help with voter registration in the civil rights movement. In addition, the students were confronted with major issues of human concern, through trips that involved the inner city ghetto, public housing, rural communities, political institutions, industrial systems. So we tried and sought to be ecumenical. Another value in the early years was the concern to be integrative, to hold together theory and practice, to put together the learnings of the classroom and the actions of the field. Early on, there was field education, as we then called it. Every student was expected to be in a church or organization where what they were learning could be put into practice and evaluated. There was also a weekly integrative seminar in which all the faculty participated along with the students. Major theological works by those of Tillich and Niebuhr were used to focus their studies in the various fields. Thus, the focus of the first curriculum was theology. This was to be a theological school, not a school of divinity, producing divines for the church. Nor a school of religion, producing religious study, but a school dedicated to learning the nature of the relationship of humans and God in the context of the world. One early example I like to think of in the new curriculum was the first course in the biblical field. We turned the whole sequence on its head and started the students off with biblical theology, not with Hebrew, as was often the case previously. And that course in biblical theology involved the faculty of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Read as theological statements, not as literature or history, though one needed to know that history and literature. Similarly, the traditional course in church history was transformed into historical theology, where the theological issues of the church were to be understood and incorporated into seen as a resource for theology, as well as a basis for church practice. One way the faculty sought to make integration a vital part was the design of the curriculum to require all required courses as all-day courses. We were not going to chop up the curriculum into little units, but try to make sequence and integrative in nature. This novel approach lasted for many years, but I understand no longer completely informs the present pattern. But it did allow early on for commuting students to come for 1 or 2 days rather than having Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, as often in older curriculums. Finally, I would like to highlight one further value of the that was always undergoing transformation. Very beginning, it was a real value. As I pointed out in the basis of union, it said the seminary shall provide a program of education for professional preparation of men and women for the whole ministry of the church. It is true that inclusiveness was rather limited at first, yet there have always been women in the student body. Some of the first women took courses in hopes of a degree in Christian education, but that was not to be, and one woman transferred to another seminary. A second woman came in the second term, Harriet Johnson, in the Presbyterian Church, and she was ordained as the first woman minister in the Twin Cities Presbytery. It was until 1972 that the first woman graduated with a Master of Divinity. But within 3 years, by 1975, 1/3 of the student body were women. The transformation was that fast and that quick. The increasing presence of women, of course, led to the inevitable question of language, both for the humans and the divine. A struggle that took place in the faculty and the student body for quite some time, and maybe still does, I don't know. Probably not as much. That came to be worked out. But it also pertained to religious issues as the school increasingly became diverse, with the addition of Mary Bednarowski as our first woman. Increasingly, in the student body, there were students from the Latter-day Saints, as well as Roman Catholic and Jewish sources. Reuben Hinneman used to say of the seminary, it is a seminary, a seedbed. Yes, we tried to plant both annuals and perennials. We're perennial. To be an ecumenical seminary in the upper Midwest, to be both united and uniting, open to the world in which it lived and responsive to the issues of its time and place, integrative in theory and practice, striving to be theological in focus, and inclusive in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. Thank you.
And for our students, the first one, from the class of 65, the first one is Paul Kepke.
Got it? Is it on? Is it on? It's on. Wow. This is quite an experience, and I would like 4 of my colleagues who are able to be here today to please come forward and take their places up at the front table and have some sharing of information. Pardon me? Thank you. This is a moving experience, not just in terms of facility, but to see the photographs that were showing in the library as this campus was in construction. And the picture that you see over here was the Cornerstone Lane. And I remember that very clearly. A busload of us came up from the Sheboygan and the Plymouth, Wisconsin area to do the singing, and I can point out the classmates' names, and some of them are seated right over here, and I can see some faculty members in that photograph also. Here we have the faculty, myself, Bob Tripp, who's at the front table, Bruce Unglesby, Frederick Harburg. Fred was a Moravian, and that was quite an experience to have someone from that tradition. Roy Siebert, will be with us today, but he lives in Pleasant Hill, Tennessee, in a UCC retirement community down there. Larry Bramer, who's here, Oliver Kudrin, who's here, Jervis Meinzer from Milwaukee, who now resides somewhere in Texas. I got some names and numbers of our classmates, and I tried to call all these people, and when I tried to call Mr. Meinzer, this voice, a gruff voice, says, "Who are you? What do you want?" I had the wrong number. He said, "Don't ever call this number again." Al Schwenke, probably the oldest member in our class, who was a missionary in Ghana for many years. Ron Getze from Ohio, Delbert Perman, Lynn Gaylor. Lynn is, right now, he was lost. We didn't have an address for him. And thanks to the wife of beloved, can't think of his name, Milo Sheldon. Milo Sheldon's wife traced this down for us. Milo just passed away in March, and that's another story. We'll talk about that. But Lynn is alive in an assisted living place in Hayfield, Minnesota. So he's around. Phil Miley, and I'm going to be reading a letter that Phil has written. Ken Dix, who passed away last September. And this is Ron Saylor, who has a couple of ideas he shared with me that I'll share. So here's my colleague sitting up here. And Carl, you want to share with us a memory of that's very special to you about this transition and our life together?
Well, we're on. When Kylie invited me to say the opening prayer for lunch today, somehow that German prayer popped into my mind. It wasn't because I was a cradle German speaker. People in my mother's family spoke German when little ears shouldn't hear what's being spoken. And my mother's family really traced back to the founders of Mission House. They were part of the Lipper colony of eastern Wisconsin that generated that seminary. No, that prayer Midler year and the year that I was going to spend on an internship in Rhode Island. By the way, my wife Jean over here is the souvenir of that intern year in Rhode Island. We ought to say she cried when I brought her over the Hudson River because she left civilization. But I was sent out to McCook, Nebraska. Anybody know McCook, Nebraska? The heat of that summer to serve a little German-Russian church, and part of the task there was to sit in on the Sunday afternoon prayer meeting. The Gebetbrudergemeinschaft met every Sunday afternoon. The elder always had some opening verse-by-verse explication of Scripture, so I was very careful when the young green seminarian had to talk about that same scripture. I really didn't want to contradict what he was saying, but I really didn't understand what he was saying. And then after that, there were German gospel hymns, and then the men would pray each in succession, and then all the women would join in, and one of the things they would end up doing was Tausendmal seid dir, liebster Jesu, Dank dafür, in Jesu Name, Amen. And I remembered that all those years, and so a thousand thanks, really, to some of the founders, people like Reuben Hienemann and Louis Gunneman, who gave such a great shape to this place. People like Art Merrill, who ran us through our paces and Hebrew grammar and kept our noses to the grindstone on the basics, and I really appreciated that about United. I've served on committees on the ministry, and we've had people come in from a lot of seminaries that have a lot of strange things on their seminary records, strange classes that they've taken, and sometimes pretty lean on the basics. Here we had this, a good grounding in the basics, although I'd like to come back and take that beer making course sometime. So those are just a few of the things that come directly to mind. There were good experiences. Paul was talking about Lloyd Beebe, who did the
Chaplaincy?
chaplain. Yeah, he was chaplain down at Hennepin General, and so the semester down there, that brought to mind one time that he sent me in to have a conversation with a man suffering deep depression. Well, the man was a proctologist on the staff of the hospital there, and Lloyd said, well, you can kind of understand why a proctologist would have depressions. So I learned to go in and listen to people. That was great learning there. Clyde Steckel was down at the university in the first year that we were here and was on the faculty later on, but got to know him because I was doing field work at First Congregational. And an interesting year because the pastor resigned in the middle of the year, and kind of loose ends, and we had to kind of get through that year. So just a lot of wonderful memories, slogging through the mud, of course, and in these brand new buildings, all the temporary arrangements, and then going away for that intern year and coming back and having new faculty, and some of the things that Art was talking about, the development of curriculum was progressing, and pulling together a whole lot, and I certainly appreciated Tom Campbell because he was the one person who could get up there and scribble the whole blackboard or green board full of diagrams, and you ended up, by gosh, it was the first time I really had some understanding of Paul Tillich. The sign's up for me, so I better quit.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Larry.
We're hearing all the different stories. I think I'll start from a slightly different tact of a personal journey. And that is that when I was in about the 10th grade, I decided to become a minister. And along the way, started my ecumenical journey because I also, about that time, worked with a commercial photographer, took a lot of wedding pictures. Most of them were in Roman Catholic churches. And I used to carry the six-pack to the priest and help him with his paraments and so forth, and pull the little altar boys out of the way so that you could get the right photograph. But I learned a number of things from that. And then I attended Texas Lutheran College. My evangelical folks were worried about that. They thought that they would lose me. Instead, I stole one of their gals. But that was my thing. But while I was at TLC, a classmate of mine was Dick Baumer. And his dad was a minister in West Bend, Wisconsin, and part of the seminary boards. And from him, I learned about this place called United Seminary. Along the way, I even intercepted some kind of way. I got a letter from somebody by the name of Gunneman, who may have been sent to the wrong person, but it was a letter trying to get Niebuhr to come here as a professor. And having only been out of the state of Texas twice, I decided if I had to go north, why go to Eden? All the other people around were E&E, Elmhurst, Eden people, and I didn't see that they were so fantastic. And so I decided, well, if I got to go north, let's go north. And so then I signed up to come to United. Scheduled to come in September. I think September 22nd was to be the beginning of seminary. And in the process, my wife got a job teaching at Como Park Junior High School, and so we had to come up in August. And we came down to Heinemann's room, our house down on the corner there someplace, the president. He was gone, and Dean Gunneman dealt with us, walked us out around the back of the building, pointed up here, and said, "That's where it's going to be." And that was the truth. That was the truth. And so school started. And then the memories here, of course, with the electricians and so forth, finishing the job while we were having classes, working in that way. A number of events that occurred during the seminary. Kennedy's assassination, a tornado came through. Tornado was an interesting thing for me because I was in the basement. We lived over on Highway 8. I had a little study thing in the basement, and we were down in the basement, and the phone started ringing up the stairs. And I ran up the stairs to answer it. It was Stratford, Wisconsin, which is where I was going to become the minister. And they wanted to know if this desk that had arrived with a damage on the corner was to be accepted or not. I had bought that desk with a little bit of a damage, but they were supposed to fix it. And so I said, well, it didn't get fixed. Yeah, go ahead and accept it. Bye. Back to the... I got out there, and of course, there was a damage on the corner, but as happens in those places, the neighbor worked for Weyerhaeuser, and we got a nice walnut thing to finish it off. The seminary, many things, you learn things like you pays your money and you takes your pick. I don't know if anybody else has heard that, or it's 6 of one, half dozen of another. Don't throw the baby out with the wash. But Campbell has been mentioned a couple of times, and I think from him I still have the thing when you're reading a book, know who wrote that book and what's their prejudice, where it's coming from. That grows out of a sociological background in college too, with statistics, know what your universe is. And that has become very, very important over the years. Part of what Carl mentioned, I think what we learned here were the meaning of things rather than the process of how to do things. So, to this day, I see people coming up, how do you do a baptism? How do you do this? How do you do that? Well, once you know what it means, you can mess it up a little bit if you want to.
Thank you.
I don't know where to start. I guess I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the faculty at United. My wife and children were caught in a snowstorm once, and couldn't make it back. And a call came into the seminary, and I wasn't here. Dean Gunneman took the call, got in his car, drove and picked up Nancy and the kids, and brought them back. That was the kind of faculty that United had. If I needed something, they were there. Sometimes they didn't provide it, but they provided the people that would. I would think that on our hands, we could count on both hands a number of times financially that I couldn't make it through seminary. And we get a check from some church that Dean Gunneman had called, or Jayberg had called, and that check kept us going for the 4 years. Let me respond to the ecumenical aspect of this thing. When I was doing my student, what do you call it when you worked at the church? What? Field education. I got a Methodist church and knew nothing at all about it. How many know about Brunswick Methodist Church? Do they still get somebody from here? So I went, and I had a great year. Minister there couldn't stand the name Brunswick Methodist Church. The reason that they named it was on Brunswick Avenue. And in doing the research to teach confirmation class, I found out that the first Methodist circuit in America was the Brunswick Circuit. And when he found that out, I mean, it was a whole new world for him. And it was a great experience. And to this day, my relationship with the Methodists and my morning breakfast class, our group, has always been a real blessing. And that's one of the things that I got out of here. The other thing is that I was blessed, and I think God takes care of us in many, many different ways. You know, not being able to have the financial means to do things. One of the first things that happened to us, because the seminary was still putting in roads and so forth when we moved in, was that my old 46 Nash hit a pothole, and it put a hole in the oil pan and drained all the oil out, and I had it repaired, and it lasted for the whole 4 years I was in seminary. Another real blessing. Yankton School of Theology had comprehensive exams. Mission House had a thesis. I worked from the time I started Mission House to coming here on my thesis, because I'm kind of slow, and mine was going to be on President Kennedy as a Catholic, what that meant to be President of the United States as a Catholic. Just about got it all finished, and lo and behold, they couldn't decide for that first graduating class whether we were to have a thesis or comps. And you know what they decided? Forget it. We didn't have either of them. I got through. And then going into the Air Force as a chaplain, I invited a number of the professors, put their names in, and they came and did 2-week theology training and so forth to the chaplains. And there was enough of the people from United who had done that in the course of my 20 years that when I finally got around to coming back here for my master's study, they told me I didn't need it because I had gotten enough from the seminary professors that had come around. See what happens? Finally, do you still have your trophy from bowling?
You better explain
I was
that.
trying to explain to them what it was like. You know what it was for? I think you were the most improved. We had a lot of fun with bowling teams while we were here, and we also had a lot of fun because that was the time that the choir went down south, just after Martin Luther King's so forth, and we sang at black universities in the South. And that was quite an experience for us because we had a bus driver who had to get off every 50 miles because the bus driver feared for their life. And they would get a new bus driver and off we would go. And we stayed in various homes in Tougaloo and Talladega and so forth. And at Tougaloo, they were having a prom. And we went to the prom, and beautiful gowns, and they did this march around the gymnasium and everything, and you could hear it crinkle. The prom dresses were made out of paper for some of the girls. Beautiful, beautiful gowns. Well, that same night we were walking through the town, and one of the people that was hosting us, the young man got pushed through a window in one of the stores by a white person. And so it was those kinds of experiences that we had back then that helped to give us some more insights in what ministry was about and what people's backgrounds and lifestyles and so forth were all about. So I treasure all of those, and I'll never forget United.
Thank you. I have a letter here from one of our colleagues who's not here today. His name is Phil Miley. Phil came from New Holstein, Wisconsin. And he said in his letter, when we arrived at UTS, it was an enclave of civilization in a near wilderness. Squinting to the west, there was a glimpse of a suburban subdivision, and to the east, over the lip of the plateau, you could see the peaks of faculty housing. Phil was quite a writer. And to the southeast, unseen but not unsmelt, was a pig farm. The wind rarely blew from that direction, fortunately, because the stench was most unpleasant. And then he goes on to say there are only two buildings, the classroom wing and the main library, administrative and faculty offices, and a basement dining area and the seminary's own theological bookstore. And because of the restricted space, now he's tipping his hand, smoking was not permitted, not even in the basement dining area. And so the handful of us smokers deemed The Brotherhood of the Fragrant Weed by Dean Lewis Gunneman stood outside the southwest door, and if we saw Dean Gunneman while stamping our feet in the Minnesota winter, we could almost imagine him secretly smiling at our folly. But we knew his compassion was so great that more likely he was silently shaking his head and praying for our weakness. We now come to the first day. Perk up. I had the privilege of beginning my theological education at Mission House Seminary outside of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And Professor Arthur Merrill, his opening words to our junior class brought us up sharply. And I'm confident that as we merged into UTS, Prof. Merrill's approach to new seminarians has not changed. And his first words were, "There is no such thing as a late paper in this class." Because you cannot stand at a pulpit on Sunday morning and say, "Sorry, gang, but it's been a busy week and I didn't have time to prepare a sermon." You said that, didn't you? And then Phil said, "No one can argue with such logic." And then he goes on to say, a few weeks later in the first year, it was time to consecrate our larger assembly room at the west end of the classroom building as our chapel. And Dr. Paul Hammer, the professor of New Testament theology, was designated as the proclaimer of the word for that occasion. And some of us wondered how Prof. Hammer would fit this occasion into his famous 3 points of a sermon: our Christ, the church, and the world. And it seemed as if the task would defeat him. But then the conclusion went something like this: "And so we have the communion table of the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. And second, we have the congregation's assembly space. And third, we have the doors which lead us out into the world." Our class was part of what was probably the most tense and intense morning prayer service that ever occurred at UTS. The day was the Monday morning after President John F. Kennedy informed the Soviet Union that he was establishing a naval quarantine of Cuba and was prepared to stop and to search any Soviet ship approaching the island to ensure it carried no ballistic missiles or missile parts. And in the opening prayer portion of that morning prayer service, conflicting petitions were lifted up by God for the theoretical possibility of over a decade that the Cold War might erupt into a hot nuclear war had gripped us as a real fear, as it did the rest of the nation. And then finally he says, we graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity degree, and when the nation's theological seminaries decided that 3 years of post-college graduate education warranted more than a bachelor's degree, UTS did not simply transform our BDs into MDivs. Since most of the UTS faculty had spent significant time in parish ministries, They knew how difficult it was for many pastors to keep up with the studying. Therefore, our degrees would only be transformed after a several-week refresher experience. And this requirement was known as a conversion program. It was not only renewing, but it was also most enjoyable. This is Phil Miley, New Holstein, Wisconsin, where he's now retired. Well, thank you all for listening, and I was going to not touch on this, but I feel so many points have been made about how faculty have touched us and shaped us up and made us completely different people, and I've just got to share one little personal story. I grew up in a place called Kohler, Wisconsin. You know about that place. And there were a lot of American kids there, but I was born in 1939, and my father was a German immigrant. And so my mother tongue was German. My mother was born of German parents in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I grew up speaking German. And I went to kindergarten, 1944, 1945. Think what was going on. WW2, the big one, as Archie Bunker said. And we had a show and tell time when all the classmates would tell what was going on in their lives. And the boys would talk about the story of the letters their fathers had written in WW2. And so guess what they did at playtime? They played war games. And it took a couple of weeks for me to figure out why I was never on the winning side. And why the assignment always was, Kepke, you play dead today. And I was the one to be shot and play dead. I guess, what do we call that today? When we, what? Bullying, yeah, that was early bullying. And so my mother went to see Miss Skeets. And she told Miss Skeets what I was doing at home. And finally, she said she would look into it, but she never did. And so my mother told me some good Christian advice: fight back. And I did. And I remember Miss Skeets pulling me off the other boys and looking in my face and shaking her finger and saying, "Your people killed my brother. Your people killed my brother." Fast forward to UTS, one of Lloyd Beebe's pastoring classes. He had noticed something that I said. And so he said to me in a very nice way, he said, "Paul," he said, "I want to talk to you after class." And he said, "That remark you made, tell me more about that." And that was my coming out party, so to speak. That for the first time I could face and embrace, because of a faculty member of this institution, a deep hurt that happened to me early in my life. And I could now embrace it and go beyond it and realize that I have a blessing of I'm a multicultural person. And I can exist in different cultures. Had it not been for the contact that we had here at UTS and in this environment, my life would have been completely different. And I need to thank you all and the faculty for what you have done, not just for us, but so that we can go out and minister in the world. So thank you for your listening this afternoon. I have a beautiful card here from one of our colleagues who passed away, Milo Sheldon. Milo was from Yankton. And when I said to his wife on the phone, "Can you write anything about UTS?" and she laughed and chuckled and she said, "Two things." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "Milo loved the bookstore. He was manager of the bookstore." And I said, "And what's the second thing?" He said, "Ping pong," she said. He was addicted to ping pong. Well, Milo served in many parishes, but his other addiction was that he loved automobiles, little 125th models of cars. And in his retirement, he opened a museum. He had over 1,000, 2,000 cars in South Dakotas, and for 3 years they ran that place. So the latter days of his life were a very enjoyable experience. Milo Sheldon.
Please join me in thanking all of our panelists and Art Merrill. And Paul, thank you for doing all of this. What a wonderful, rich afternoon, and you've got us off to a great start. Thank you so much.